This video is an introduction to phenomenology. This is a methodology that is quite often invoked. It is complex, and part of the reason for that is that this is also a theoretical perspective, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that. So when we think about the definition of phenomenology, borrowing from Van Manen's work helps us to see what it is that distinguishes this particular methodology. So it is a study of lived experience, and that lived experience occurs in what is called the life world. And what's important about the notion of a life world is that it is an emphasis on what we immediately experience, the experiences we have, not how we conceptualize or reflect on or make sense of in a cognitive way those experiences, but rather the experiences themselves as we have them. So what are some key concepts for phenomenological research? Well, the life world, that is the space in which humans exist, and within that life world we have experiences, these lived experiences. What's important, though, again, is that these are pre-reflective experiences. So the emphasis in phenomenology is how people experience things. And this notion of intentionality, unfortunately, doesn't have the common sense meaning that you might assume. So it's not that we intend to have an experience or to know an experience. It's not about our personal intention. Phenomenologists use this term intentionality to imply that experiences are of something, and those experiences and the meaning of those experiences lies in the space between us and the object of our experience, so that there has to be this connection. And for phenomenologists, the term that's used is object, but that object might be an actual object, but it could be another person. It could be anything that's outside of us. It could even be ourselves. Phenomenologists pay attention to the structure of experiences, and these are the three core ways that experiences can be structured: as wholes and parts. That's fairly obvious. The idea of manifolds. Manifold means many. So for phenomenologists, the idea is that there are many ways of having what apparently seems like the same experience. So you and I may go to the dentist, and we are having the experience of being at the dentist's office and engaging in that experience, but we might experience it quite differently. And then the idea of presence and absence. That's important because we as humans can make sense of things when we see them, when we have the experience, when we smell them, see them, hear them, when we're having an experience, but we also can understand experience by what's not there as well. So those three structures are very important. And then lastly, the notion of bracketing, and this is connected to the idea of pre-reflective experience. So it's really for us as researchers to put aside whatever we think we know about a phenomenon in our interest in our investigation in terms of understanding more about that phenomenon. So as researchers, we bracket our prior knowledge to the greatest extent possible. So as I mentioned, phenomenology is also a theoretical perspective and has a very rich philosophical background. And when you read about phenomenology, you will no doubt come across the work of both Husserl and Heidegger, who are the two names associated with the kind of primary framing philosophically for phenomenology. So Husserl really is credited with being the person who gave sort of form and purpose to phenomenology. And one of the key things that Husserl did was make an effort to overcome what's called the Cartesian dualism, or the mind-body dualism. And so until Husserl started to think about these ideas, the presumption was that the mind and the body were distinct, and that meaning was made in the mind. And Husserl wanted to disrupt that and think about human experience in a kind of more corporeal way, in the sense of the experiences that we have as we live them are more a combination of a kind of wholeness of person. Husserl's early work, he had a much more greater sense of individual autonomy and learning about phenomenon by imagining individuals as having control over their context. Heidegger wasn't exactly a student of Husserl's, but he's sort of he's contemporary, but his work followed, and he really moved phenomenology into what's called this interpretive kind of phase. And this is the more common philosophical grounding that most people doing phenomenological research would use. So for Heidegger, rather than thinking about individuals and autonomy, he very much more focused on people situated in context. And so a focus on intersubjectivity, ways in which relationships of people to the life world, people within the life world, have experiences. And it's really out of this perspective that the notion of critical phenomenology grew, which really is just about looking at the life experience of those who are in less privileged, more marginalized contexts and parts of the life world. So what does it look like when we do phenomenological research? Well, the data collection methods that are used, oftentimes interviews, but there's a whole source of data that can be also mined. Documents, journals, art, even personal individual introspection on a researcher's part. But oftentimes interviews are the most common way that data are made. Data analysis in phenomenology is thematic. So there's this kind of careful reading of the data and allowing a kind of sense of what the thematic frames are, but with attention to these three structures of a phenomenon that I already mentioned: the whole part, the manifolds, and the presence-absence sort of idea. And what's really important when we think about phenomenology is that the unit of analysis is the phenomenon. It is not individual research participants. So we have research participants, we may interview them, but the individual is not the unit of analysis. We're interested in the phenomenon that they share. So I've given you an example here of what a phenomenological research question might be. How might working class labor, that's the phenomenon of interest in this question, take shape for people in rural and racially and economically diverse communities? So there's nothing kind of special about the question, but it very clearly focuses on a phenomenon that we might be interested in. So if you're interested in learning more about phenomenology, I think one of the critical things is that it is important to understand phenomenology as a theoretical perspective, and then to understand it as a methodological strategy that you might use. So the two books that I've given here as a suggested entree is Sokolowski's book, Introduction to Phenomenology, which is a very approachable but good introduction to phenomenology from a philosophical perspective, and then Mark Vagel's book, Crafting Phenomenological Research, much more focused on phenomenology as a methodology. And I've given some links as well to other places that you might look. The top link, Phenomenology Online, is Max van Manen's website, and it is a very rich source, especially for this interpretive approach to phenomenology. There are, much of his writing is there, and there are many examples of work, much of it by his students, that give you a sense of what phenomenological research looks like. And that, complicated and complex as it is phenomenology.